It's a pleasure to present the Nature, Wealth, and Power Framework for Improving Rural Development. The framework was first developed in 2002 and has recently undergone a fairly major revision. It's about leveraging natural and social capital for resilient development. It aims to provide best practices and a framework for improving the success of rural development activities, such as food production and poverty reduction, which are key to the world's long-term future. NWP is a systems approach to integrating technical and biophysical concerns, or nature, with economic improvements and poverty reduction, or wealth, with good enough governance, or power. Not only is this possible and needed, it is essential. While over the years there have been significant advances in technology and market-based approaches, the returns on these investments have not always been there. Efforts to promote good enough governance to provide incentives for investing in technology and capturing benefit are needed. The NWP story is one of integration, but with special emphasis on getting to good enough governance of natural resources. We would like to begin with a story of sorts. The first image you see is of an area of Niger in West Africa. The dark spots are trees or clumps of trees. The next image is the exact same area, but you will notice much less vegetation. The next image shows a hillside in Nepal, and there is good tree cover and terracing. The final image shows the same area, degraded and eroded. But is this your classic story of environmental degradation, of local people recklessly overexploiting their immediate surroundings? Actually, no. It's an inspiring story of environmental recovery and management by local people. Putting the dates in helps to see this. In both these cases, local people have been essential to the recovery of the environment under certain conditions. NWP is about those conditions. It should be pointed out that these environmental results did not come at the expense of poverty reduction or local empowerment. They were essential to it. The NWP framework is relevant to a number of resources and geographic regions. In Brazil, a program based on an NWP approach has strengthened the rights of indigenous groups and has allowed at least one group to own and sell its carbon in a payment for environmental services approach. The group's capacity has also been strengthened, and they have developed a long-term sustainability plan for their territory. In Bangladesh, an NWP approach has been used for the co-management of forestry and fisheries. Here, communities have been granted increased access to local resources by the state through 10-year leases and have shown their ability to manage these resources for sustainability and profit. Nepal has a history of over 20 years in community forestry. Initially granted some rights over degraded areas, many forest user groups have managed to restore the productivity of these areas and benefit from environmental services and forest products. There are now over 17,000 forest user groups federated in an apex organization which actively supports members and advocates for their interests. We would now like to lay out the NWP framework in an abbreviated version. Nature. The nature dimension of rural development is mainly about safeguarding, restoring, and increasing the productivity of rural systems. Productivity is key to meeting the demands of an expanding population and climate change. Rural production systems are complex and integrated, and rural areas are diverse. Luckily, many natural systems are resilient and respond fairly quickly to simple new techniques and rules of management. While continued investments in science and technology are necessary, many techniques and technologies are already available, and under the right incentive framework, local farmers and rural producers can reach out and get the techniques they need for increasing productivity. Wealth. In many cases, natural resources are undervalued and the returns from these assets inappropriately reinvested. Benefit sharing between local actors in the state and private sector can lack equity and lead to distorted incentives. In addition, rural markets may not work well because of information and access asymmetries and buyer and seller monopolies. Improving benefit sharing, value chains, and markets not only help reduce rural poverty, but can also provide incentives for investments in increasing productivity and sustainable resource use. Power. Fundamental to successful rural development is governance. What is often needed are incremental improvements that can be made on the ground to promote good enough governance. This allows local people access and control over resources, procedural and property rights, and transparent and accountable systems. Many of these steps seem small, such as increasing local user rights and access over local resources through co-management or the reorienting of leases and concessions. These steps can have a big impact, however. Subsidiarity, representation, and social inclusion, including gender and female empowerment, can pay large dividends in terms of poverty reduction and positive environmental outcomes. Tying it all together is a systems approach. Individually, ecosystems and social systems are complex, not to mention where they overlap in the cases of rural development. These complex systems and interactions require adaptive management. Adaptive management is a structured, iterative process of decision-making in the face of uncertainty. System monitoring and continuous learning helps accrue information needed to improve future management. Adaptive management is based on a learning process. It can improve long-run management outcomes. Now we'd like to take a closer look at Namibia. At independence in 1990, the government of Namibia was eager to empower local black populations and promote equity. An attempt to extend rights over wildlife resources and benefits to local communities was initiated, the Conservancy Program. If communities met certain conditions, certain rights over wildlife would be transferred to them, allowing them to manage resources for local economic growth. Communities had to work with their neighbors to identify boundaries of the Conservancy, develop benefit-sharing plans, and develop local institutions. With the transfer of rights, both consumptive, or hunting, and non-consumptive, or ecotourism, use of wildlife became possible, and therefore benefits became possible. This slide shows the impact of the Conservancy Program on the natural resource base, or in this case, on wildlife numbers. The graphs on the left indicate that in the 80s, wildlife populations were very low, although they started to increase slightly in the 1990s. With the onset of the Conservancy Program, the wildlife numbers continued to increase, as you can see also in the graphs on the right, and some of these populations seem to have stabilized. This graph shows the benefits that have accrued from the Conservancy Program. You can see in the early 1990s there was relatively negligible benefit coming out of these programs. The new policy was initiated in 1996. Conservancy started forming, and you can see a steady trend in the increase in benefits, both direct benefits from the conservancies themselves and from other community-based natural resource management activities. This is a very interesting slide that shows the investment in the Conservancy Program and the revenue that was generated. You can see clearly that in the 1990s, spending on the program exceeded revenue generated. But in 2002, you could see that revenue now has greatly surpassed the investments of either the private sector, the NGOs, or donors, or the government, and has become a net benefit for Namibia. One of the interesting things about this particular slide that it shows the period of time necessary for projects to mature and become sustainable. This last slide on Namibia shows the extent of the Conservancy Program. There are now 77 conservancies covering 15 million hectares, or about 19% of the country. 260,000 people are involved. About 1 in 8 Namibians are involved in Conservancy Program now. This is a natural resource management program that has had transformational effects at the national level. Now we'd like to talk a minute about Senegal. Traditionally, success of these types of programs is measured along the 3 dimensions of nature, wealth, and power. However, a recent study from Senegal shows more global level impact, implying that the synergistic effects of NWP impact the fundamentals of well-being in a structural way. The Wulanafa project, which ran from 2008 to 2013, emphasized the role of governance and economic incentives to enable individuals and communities to manage natural resources sustainably and profitably. The program undertook a range of activities such as forest management, conservation farming, improvements of the lucrative charcoal value chain, processing and marketing of non-wood forest products, and other activities. It built capacity and provided technical assistance to communities and local government. To ensure wealth creation, the program created synergies by bringing all stakeholders together to agree on marketing strategies and then design a value chain approach. Management committees were set up, and training in administrative and financial management were provided by the program. Here are a couple of statistics from the program. Almost 3,000 enterprises were assisted, 15,000 new jobs created, including 5,000 for women. 1,700 enterprises improved their business practices, generating revenues totaling about $41 million. The number of people who increased their revenues thanks to the program were about 35,000, 20,000 of whom were women. This slide shows the percentage of households having wealth assets in the Wulanafa areas and in control areas at two different time periods. The bars that are now circled indicate the situation in 1997, and you can see that Wulanafa villages lagged behind control villages in the possession of any of these assets. A survey done in 2010, however, shows that the Wulanafa villages have not only caught up with the control villages, but have surpassed them in the control of these important assets. This slide shows the impact on employment and nutrition in the Wulanafa areas versus control areas. The table on the left illustrates the impacts on employment in Wulanafa areas and control areas. This impact is disaggregated by gender. In terms of women, you can see that the Wulanafa areas perform better on a whole range of employment statistics than their counterparts in the control areas. The impact is even greater for women, as they have benefit more from the Wulanafa project in terms of employment. The table on the right tells the story of nutritional status of women in the Wulanafa area and in control areas. You can see for anemia for women and several statistics for children that the Wulanafa areas are doing better than the control areas. The original Nature, Wealth, and Power document is shown here. It focused mainly on Africa and traditional resources like forests, wildlife, and fisheries. NWP2 is much broader in scope than NWP. It goes beyond Africa to other geographic areas. It goes beyond traditional resources to cover things like agriculture and ecosystem services. And it goes beyond projects to deal with programmatic and policy issues. NWP2 also delves into more detail, particularly on the nature and wealth fronts. NWP2 has, in addition, a lot more information on how to implement the approach. It has an illustrative toolbox and more detailed information on a number of key cases. The ideas of NWP are no longer as new as in 2002, but they remain relevant today. The approach is not always easy to implement, since it directly confronts power, political issues, and vested interests. Progress is needed, however, if we are to build a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient world. Thanks for listening.